Winter 1945. A former military barracks. Somewhere in Allied-occupied territory, the war is not yet officially over. But for the women inside this compound, time has already broken loose from meaning. Japanese military nurses and civilian auxiliaries, captured during the final months of the Pacific War, stand in silence as steam curls upward from a row of metal shower pipes. For many of them, it is the first time in years they have seen hot water used so freely. The air smells of damp concrete and soap, an unfamiliar luxury. Guards gesture calmly. No shouting. No rifles raised. The women hesitate, uncertain if this is a test, a trick, or a fleeting kindness before punishment. In the Imperial Japanese system, captivity meant shame. Comfort was never promised. Often it was forbidden. One woman reaches out, placing her hand under the flow. It is warm, not imagined. Not rationed by drops. Truly warm. Around her, others follow, some silently crying, some frozen in disbelief. This simple act, so ordinary elsewhere in the world, feels unreal here. Not because of the water itself, but because of what it represents. A different way of war. A different understanding of power. And in that moment, long-held assumptions about the enemy begin to fracture. Just as the larger story behind this encounter begins to unfold. Asterisk, by the time these women stepped into Allied custody, the Pacific War had already consumed much of their adult lives. To understand why hot water could feel so shocking, so disorienting, one must first understand the world they came from, world shaped by scarcity, ideology, and an uncompromising code of endurance. Japan, in the 1930s and early 1940s, was a nation mobilized for total war. Resources were finite. Comfort was considered weakness. From factories to farms, from schools to hospitals, the population was trained to accept deprivation as a patriotic duty. The state preached self-sacrifice, not as a burden, but as moral virtue. Endurance was honor. Complaint was disgraced. This philosophy extended deeply into the Imperial Japanese military system. Soldiers were taught that surrender was worse than death. Captivity was not survival, it was erasure. Prisoners of war were assumed to have forfeited their humanity the moment they laid down their arms. This belief did not remain abstract. It shaped behavior, policy, and daily life. Japanese POW camps across Asia became infamous for brutality. Allied prisoners endured starvation, rations, forced labor, disease, and beatings. But less discussed is how this same culture of austerity and harsh discipline also governed. Japanese forces, themselves including women who served as nurses, clerks, radio operators, and factory laborers attached to the military machine. Many of these women were not frontline combatants, yet they lived under the same ideological pressure. They were expected to endure hunger without complaint, cold without fire, exhaustion without rest. Hygiene was minimal. Hot water was rare and often forbidden except for the severely ill. Bathing, when possible, was done quickly, communally, and with cold water, regardless of climate. By 1944, as Allied forces pushed closer to the Japanese home islands, conditions deteriorated further. Shipping lanes were cut, fuel vanished, medical supplies ran low, nurses reused bandages, civilians scavenged for roots and bark. Even military installations lacked basic sanitation. Cleanliness became a luxury that war could no longer afford. For Japanese women stationed across the Pacific Islands, in occupied territories, or near collapsing supply, hub survival meant constant adjustment downward. Fewer calories, less soap, less privacy, less warmth. Each deprivation was framed as proof of loyalty to the emperor, and beneath it all lay the unspoken fear: if captured, what would the enemy do? That fear had been cultivated deliberately. Imperial propaganda portrayed Allied forces as cruel, barbaric, and vengeful, especially toward women. Stories circulated of abuse, humiliation, and violence. Surrender, women were told, meant dishonor worse than death. Many were encouraged to take their own lives rather than fall into enemy hands, so when Allied troops finally arrived, often after fierce fighting or sudden collapse, those who survived capture carried not just physical exhaustion, but years of terror. Shaped by ideology, they did not expect mercy. They did not expect dignity, and they certainly did not expect hot water. Yet, that moment in the shower did not exist in isolation. It was the product of a very different military culture, one shaped by international law, logistical capacity, and a contrasting view of what prisoners represented in war. And to understand that contrast, we must now step outward to the Allied system that received them. By the time Allied forces began taking large numbers of Japanese prisoners in the Pacific, the war had entered a different phase. The early chaos of island fighting WWII had given way to an organized advance supported by massive logistics. By 1944 and 1945, the United States and its allies were operating the largest supply network in human history. Ships crossed the Pacific in constant rotation. Fuel, food, medicine, and water followed the armies wherever they landed. This logistical reality shaped how prisoners were treated, not out of sentiment, but structure. The Allies, particularly the United States, were bound by the 1929 Geneva Convention. Relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, Japan had signed but never ratified the convention, and in practice ignored most of its provisions. The Allied command, however, viewed compliance as both a legal obligation and a strategic tool. Proper treatment of prisoners reduced resistance, encouraged surrender, and reinforced moral authority. By late war, Allied POW processing centers had standardized procedures. Captured personnel, regardless of nationality, were searched, registered, deloused, medically examined, and issued clean clothing when possible. Bathing was not optional. It was mandatory. Disease was the enemy no commander could afford. Lice spread typhus. Skin infections festered in tropical climates. Clean water, soap, and showers were not luxuries. They were preventative medicine. Military doctors understood that sanitation saved lives and preserved manpower. For Japanese, women taken into custody, many of them nurses, auxiliary workers, or civilians attached to military units, this process was bewildering. They arrived malnourished. Many were dehydrated. Some were wounded. Others had lived for months without adequate washing facilities. Their hair was often matted. Skin conditions were common. Menstrual hygiene had been nearly impossible under wartime shortages, and yet, upon arrival at Allied facilities, the routine was the same. They were separated by gender. Female guards or medical personnel were assigned whenever available. Privacy screens were erected. Instructions were given calmly, often through interpreters or gestures. Then came the showers in many camps. Hot water was standard, not because it was meant as kindness, but because fuel and heating capacity made it practical. Water tanks were heated in bulk. pipes ran through temporary barracks. Compared to the deprivation of Japanese installations, the system felt almost unreal. For the women, the shock was immediate. Some hesitated, convinced it was a trick. Others feared scalding. Many had never experienced a sustained hot shower in years. In some cases, not since before the war began. Survivor testimonies later described the sensation as overwhelming. The heat against skin that had known only cold water or none at all. Soap that lathered freely. Steam filling the room. Dirt dissolving and running away. Several women broke down and cried not from joy, but confusion. This was not how the enemy was supposed to behave. Imperial training had taught them that capture meant humiliation, that their bodies would be violated, that they would be stripped of dignity. Instead, they were given towels, clean ones. They were allowed time to wash thoroughly. Their hair was cut only if necessary for hygiene. In many camps, they were issued replacement undergarments. Medical staff treated burns, infections, and malnutrition without interrogation. The contrast was destabilizing. Some prisoners later admitted they felt shame not because of their captors, but because of what the experience revealed. If the enemy could offer warmth and water while their own system had denied it, what did that say about the ideology they had endured? Yet this moment, the shower was only the first crack, because once the immediate shock passed, deeper realizations followed. About captivity, about survival, about how war defines humanity differently on each side of the wire. And those realizations unfolded through multiple lenses: human, cultural, psychological, and moral. Angle 1. The human body after deprivation war reduces life to its most basic functions: eat, sleep, endure. For many Japanese women captured late in the Pacific War, the body itself had become an instrument of survival, stripped of comfort and familiarity. Hunger was constant. Fatigue was normal. Hygiene was secondary, often impossible. The hot shower disrupted that equilibrium. Warm water against skin long accustomed to cold did more than clean. It reintroduced sensation. Muscles loosened. Dried salt and grime dissolved. For some, the heat triggered pain as nerves reawakened. For others, it brought dizziness, even collapse. Medical officers later noted that prolonged malnutrition made sudden warmth dangerous. Prisoners were monitored closely. Chairs were placed nearby. Water temperature was adjusted carefully, but despite precautions, the experience was emotionally overwhelming. Angle 3. Fear of deception. For many Japanese women prisoners, the hot shower was not immediately received as kindness. It was received as suspicion. Years of wartime conditioning had taught them that the enemy deceived before destroying. Comfort could be a prelude to punishment. Cleanliness could precede execution. A calm moment often preceded violence. When guards gestured toward the shower facilities, some women hesitated. Others refused outright. A few believed it was a test to see who would abandon discipline, who would reveal weakness. Rumors spread quickly. Some whispered that chemicals might be added to the water. Others feared sterilization. A small number believed the showers were part of an interrogation, method yet to be revealed. This fear was not irrational. Japanese prisoners had been taught that surrender erased honor. Anything that followed surrender was expected to be humiliating or fatal. So when hot water flowed freely, it disrupted not only the body's expectations, but the mind's defensive architecture. The absence of cruelty created cognitive dissonance. Why would the enemy offer warmth? Why would they care? Some women stepped beneath the water with eyes open, shoulders tense, braced for pain that never came. Others flinched at every sound, expecting doors to slam, guards to rush in. None of that happened. The water simply ran, and when nothing followed, no punishment, no demand, no threat, the fear slowly lost its footing. That realization did not arrive all at once, but once it did, it reshaped how captivity itself was understood. Angle 4. The power of small mercies. History often focuses on battles, treaties, and numbers. But wars are also defined by small moments. A cup of clean water, a blanket, a bar of soap. The hot shower was one such moment. It did not erase imprisonment. It did not end hunger or uncertainty, but it reintroduced dignity in a way that speeches never could. For women who had been reduced to labor units, evacuees, or survivors, the act of washing in warmth restored a private space, however briefly. Steam blurred the walls. Sound softened. The world narrowed to breath and sensation. Some women later described it as the first moment they had been alone in years. No sirens, no commands, no counting, just water. This mattered because dignity is cumulative. Once restored in one area, it becomes harder to deny elsewhere. After the showers, some prisoners began to speak more openly. Others stood straighter. A few even corrected guards when misunderstood, not with defiance, but clarity. The change was subtle, but observable. The shower did not break them. It reminded them they were already broken, and still alive. And as that awareness settled, the war itself moved toward its decisive turning point, one that would redefine captivity, survival, and memory forever. By the late summer of 1945, the war was collapsing inward on itself. Across the Pacific, Japanese forces were retreating or isolated. Supply lines were broken. Cities burned. Civilians moved through ruins with no clear sense of what still existed beyond the horizon. Inside Allied-controlled camps, Japanese prisoners, soldiers, and civilians alike felt the shift. Before they understood it, guards spoke. Differently, routines changed. The urgency that once defined every movement began to loosen. For the women held in captivity, this change did not arrive as relief. It arrived as uncertainty. War had taught them that transitions were dangerous. When rules softened, something worse often followed. Then came the news, first as fragments, then as confirmation. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. The words carried no immediate meaning. Names of cities, nothing more. But the reactions of the guards said everything. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Radios were guarded closely. Officers retreated into offices and did not emerge for hours. The world had shifted violently, irreversibly, for Japanese prisoners. The realization was devastating in ways no bombing raid could be. They understood what defeat meant, not just militarily, but existentially. Many had been raised on the belief that Japan could not lose, that surrender was impossible, that the nation's spirit was indivisible from survival itself. Now the impossible had happened, and inside the camps, that knowledge collided with an unbearable contradiction. They were alive, they were being fed, they were being allowed to bathe. The hot showers, once an anomaly, became a symbol of something larger, a war that was ending not with ritual, but with exhaustion, Some women wept when they heard the emperor would speak. Others refused to believe it. Surrender was not just a political act. It was the collapse of a moral universe. Everything they had endured, loss, displacement, hunger, fear, had been justified by eventual victory. Without it, suffering had no explanation in this emotional vacuum. The smallest acts took on enormous weight. A towel handed without force. A guard who looked away to grant privacy. Water that stayed warm long enough to finish washing. These were not gestures of forgiveness or reconciliation. They were signs that the machinery of total war was powering down. For some women, this was harder to process than cruelty. Cruelty had rules. This did not. As days passed, camp conditions stabilized further. Interrogations ceased. Work details were reduced. Notices were posted in multiple languages. Medical checks were conducted not to extract labor, but to assess health. And still, the women waited for the moment when mercy would be revealed as illusion. It never came. Instead, the unimaginable became routine. Hot water was no longer rationed to minutes. Soap was replaced. Clothing was issued without being reclaimed. For the first time since capture, their bodies were treated as human bodies, not tools, not threats. This was the true turning point, not the emperor's voice on the radio, not the formal surrender aboard a battleship, but the quiet recognition that the war no longer required their suffering for the women. This realization was both a release and a wound. If kindness was possible now, why had brutality been necessary before? The question lingered unanswered, and as the camps prepared for repatriation, the meaning of survival itself came under scrutiny, setting the stage for an aftermath defined not by victory or defeat, but by memory. The emperor's voice finally came through the radio on August 15, 1945, for many Japanese prisoners. It was the first time they had ever heard him speak. The broadcast was formal, distant, restrained. The language was archaic. The meaning was unmistakable. Japan had accepted defeat. Inside the camps, silence followed, not celebration. Not chaos, silence. Some women bowed instinctively. Others covered their ears. A few collapsed where they stood, their bodies responding before their minds could. The war had ended, but nothing told them what came next. Years of conditioning had not prepared them for survival after surrender. They had been taught how to endure, how to obey, how to die if necessary. They had not been taught how to return in the days that followed. Allied camp administrations began implementing repatriation protocols. Records were reviewed. Names were confirmed. Medical examinations increased, not as interrogations, but as safeguards. For the women, this shift was surreal. They were no longer counted as prisoners. They were counted as people. Hot showers became part of regular sanitation schedules. Privacy screens were installed. Female medical staff were introduced where possible. Clothing was distributed in proper sizes. These changes did not erase the trauma of captivity, but they altered its final chapter, and endings matter. Many survivors would later say that how captivity ended shaped how they remembered. Everything that came before, those final weeks, rewrote the emotional narrative, not to absolve the war, not to justify suffering, but to place dignity beside devastation. Some women resisted this accepting kindness felt like betrayal of the dead, of those who had not survived, of a nation still smoldering in ruins. Others embraced it quietly, recognizing that survival itself required adaptation. The hot showers remained a powerful symbol, not because they were luxurious, but because they contradicted everything the women had been taught to expect. They proved that captivity did not have to be annihilation, that enemies could choose restraint, that systems built for war could, under different conditions, preserve life. This realization carried forward into repatriation as ships were prepared to return Japanese civilians and prisoners home. Many women stepped aboard with bodies healed just enough to travel but minds permanently altered. They returned to a homeland transformed beyond recognition, cities destroyed, families missing, social structures fractured, and yet, within their memories of devastation, a strange contradiction endured in the land of the enemy. At the very end, they had been given warmth. That contradiction would trouble historians and survivors alike because it challenged the simplicity of wartime narratives. It refused to fit neatly into categories of villain and victim, and it demanded a deeper reckoning, not only with what was done, but with what could have been done differently. As these women re-entered civilian life, their experiences followed them quietly, persistently, and in the decades that followed, those memories would shape how captivity, humanity, and war itself were remembered. Which brings us to what remained after the war, when survival gave way to reflection, and the consequences of that final kindness came fully into view. Repatriation did not feel like victory. For the Japanese women leaving Allied camps in late 1945, departure was slow, procedural, and emotionally uneven. They boarded transport ships carrying little more than issued clothing, identification papers, and memories they did not yet have words for. Many expected punishment upon return. Instead, they returned to absence. Cities were flattened, entire neighborhoods erased. Transportation networks barely functioned. Food was scarce. Housing was improvised. Families had scattered or vanished entirely. The women who came home were changed, but so was the nation receiving them. Japan, in late 1945, was not the Japan they had left. The imperial system still existed, but its authority had been irrevocably altered. The military ethos that once governed daily life had collapsed overnight. Public language shifted from honor and sacrifice to survival and reconstruction. And within this fractured society, former prisoners did not know where they belonged. They carried shame, not because they had failed, but because they had lived. Many had been taught that capture was dishonor, that endurance in enemy hands was weakness, that death was preferable to surrender. Returning alive disrupted those beliefs. Women who spoke of captivity were often met with silence. Families listened but did not ask questions. Communities focused on rebuilding, not remembering, and so the memories remained internal, yet certain details refused to fade. The cold barracks, the roll calls, the hunger, and the showers. For many women, the hot water had become a boundary marker. Moment captivity shifted from pure survival to something more complex. Not kindness in the sentimental sense, but recognition. That memory resurfaced years later, often unexpectedly, in steam rising from a bathhouse, in the sound of running water, in the physical sensation of warmth on damaged skin. Psychologists working with former prisoners in the 1950s and 1960s noted this recurring phenomenon. Sensory memory tied to moments of dignity, however, Brief often carried disproportionate emotional weight. It did not erase trauma, but it complicated it. Former prisoners reported conflicting emotions. Gratitude intertwined with resentment, relief mixed with guilt. Why had mercy arrived so late? Why had it come from the enemy? Why had it not existed earlier? These questions were rarely spoken aloud. Post-war Japan prioritized unity. Occupation authorities encouraged forward-looking narratives. Trauma was acknowledged selectively, often framed through collective suffering rather than individual experience. Women, in particular, were expected to return to domestic roles quietly. Their captivity became a footnote, but memory does not obey social expectations as years passed. Survivor accounts began to surface initially in private diaries, then in small local publications, and eventually in oral history projects. And again, the showers appeared, not as a centerpiece, but as a moment of rupture, a place where assumptions about cruelty, enemy identity, and moral certainty fractured. Historians later noted that such moments often emerge in survivor narratives because they defy expectation. They resist ideological framing. They force the mind to confront contradiction, and contradiction is difficult to forget as Japan rebuilt itself into a post-war nation defined by peace and economic growth. These women aged quietly alongside it. Their stories were rarely requested, but they remained intact, waiting for a moment when the war could be examined not only through battles and treaties, but through the lived experience of those caught between systems, ideologies, and the fragile boundaries of human behavior. That moment would come slowly, and when it did, the meaning of captivity and the unexpected warmth would be re-examined under a different light. In the decades that followed, the lives of these women unfolded in silence more often than speech. They married, they worked, they raised children. Outwardly, they blended into a society determined to move forward. Japan rebuilt itself with astonishing speed. Factories rose, cities expanded, and a new generation grew up with little direct memory of the war. But the past never fully receded. For former prisoners, captivity lingered not as a single memory, but as a pattern of sensations. Sudden noises, confined spaces, the smell of disinfectant, the echo of boots in corridors, and, paradoxically, the sound of running water. Some avoided public baths altogether. Others returned to them compulsively, seeking reassurance in warmth they could control. Medical records from the post-war period show elevated rates of chronic illness among former internees, malnutrition-related disorders, joint damage from prolonged labor, and psychological conditions that had no language yet what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress. Treatment was minimal. There were no formal reintegration programs for Japanese civilians returning from Allied captivity. Unlike Allied POWs, whose governments often documented and publicized their experiences, Japanese survivors were largely left to navigate recovery on their own. Silence became the default coping mechanism when survivor testimony did begin entering public discourse in the 1970s and 1980s. It was often through women's groups, academic interviews, and regional history projects rather than national platforms. And when asked what they remembered most vividly, many did not begin with violence. They began with confusion. The moment when an enemy soldier spoke gently, the day a meal contained vegetables, the first time hot water flowed over skin that had not felt warmth in months. These moments did not redeem captivity. They exposed its complexity. They revealed how systems designed for control could still produce isolated instances of humanity, often through individual actions rather than institutional intent. Historians analyzing Allied camp administration have noted that conditions varied widely depending on location, supply chains, and local command decisions. Some camps improved drastically after mid-45 due to increased oversight and logistical stabilization. Others remained harsh until the end. For the women inside them, the difference between despair and endurance could hinge on something as simple as sanitation. Hot water did not erase hunger. It did not end confinement. It did not absolve the broader violence of the war, but it restored, briefly, a sense of self. To wash was to reclaim the body as one's own. That act mundane in peace became extraordinary in captivity. By the late 20th century, scholars began re-evaluating wartime narratives that divided history cleanly into heroes and villains. Civilian experience, especially women's experience, complicated those divisions. The story of Japanese women in Allied camps did not fit easily into national mythologies, neither of victimhood nor of aggression. It occupied an uncomfortable middle ground, and it was there, in that space, that the memory of hot water endured, not as a symbol of forgiveness, but as evidence that even within systems built by war, human choices still mattered, that dignity could appear unexpectedly, and that survival was not only about enduring cruelty but about recognizing moments that reminded the body it was still alive. Those moments followed these women long after the camps disappeared, and they shape how we understand captivity, not as a single story of suffering or mercy, but as a lived reality defined by contradiction, endurance, and the quiet persistence of memory. War is often remembered through battles, flags, and treaties, through victories claimed and defeats recorded. But history is also carried in smaller moments, those that never appear on maps or timelines. A bucket of hot water, steam rising in a cold room, hands trembling as they touch warmth after months without it. For the Japanese women held as prisoners near the end of the Second World War, survival was not measured only by release dates or repatriation papers. It was measured in whether the body could endure another day, whether dignity could be preserved when freedom was absent. The presence of hot water did not redefine captivity. It did not transform prisons into places of kindness, but it revealed something quieter and more unsettling, that even within vast systems of violence, individual choices still shaped human experience. Someone ordered fuel to be allocated. Someone chose to open a valve. Someone believed that prisoners were still human beings. These decisions did not undo the suffering of war. They existed alongside it. And that is what makes them endure in memory. They remind us that history is not only the story of what nations do, but of what people allow themselves to do even when hatred would be easier. For decades, these women carried their memories privately, not because they were insignificant, but because they did not fit the narratives that followed the war. Their experiences were neither heroic nor purely tragic. They were human, and humanity is often harder to categorize. Today, as the distance from the Second World War grows, stories like these become more important, not less. They challenge simplified versions of the past. They force us to look beyond absolutes. They ask us to remember that suffering can coexist with compassion, that cruelty can be interrupted, briefly, by care, that survival is sometimes sustained by the smallest mercies. Hot water was not freedom, but in captivity, it was a reminder of life before the war and the possibility of life after it. And for those who felt it on their skin, that memory endured long after the camps were dismantled, long after the war ended, and long after the world moved on. It remains, quietly, as proof that even in the aftermath of total war, humanity did not disappear completely. It waited sometimes in the most unexpected places,